Hey everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our YouTube lecture series. This week's lecture is going to be... Sorry about that, I'm filming in my daughter's room and her baby monitor slash sound machine turned on. Back to the matter at hand, we're going over the urinary system. So you're probably already aware that the urinary system's primary organs, the organs that are doing the bulk of the work, are the kidneys. What are the kidneys actually doing? Well, producing urine. The output, of course, of the kidneys is going to be the urine. But where that urine comes from is the urine contains substances that are being filtered out of the blood. So filtration of blood is the primary purpose of the urinary system, and in particular the kidneys. So the kidneys have this structure called the hilum. This is the kidney itself, looks like a kidney bean. And the hilum of the kidney is going to have 3 major vessels protruding from it. One is going to be the renal artery, and if you ever hear the term renal, that's referring to the kidneys. So the renal artery is going to be providing oxygenated blood flow. So this renal artery comes from a branch of the abdominal aorta. And the kidneys are going to return blood after it's been filtered to venous circulation through the renal vein. And that renal vein is eventually going to empty into the inferior vena cava. So you have blood coming in, filtration, blood going out. Now, the urine is actually what we call the filtrate. So filtrate is just going to be the fluid that contains everything that has been removed from the blood. And this is going to serve a number of different purposes. So just some general statistics on what the kidney is doing. It's filtering about 1,200 milliliters of blood per minute. And this is quite a lot. That's over a liter of blood. And the kidneys receive about 25% of the total cardiac output. So for every 4 liters of blood that's being pumped, 1 liter of blood is going directly to the kidneys to be filtered. So clearly this is a really important job, and that blood isn't going to the kidneys to keep them healthy. It's going there because it needs to be filtered. And what that filtration is doing is really just going to be fine-tuning all of the contents of the blood. So this includes waste. There's lots and lots of metabolic waste that can accumulate in the blood. It's picking up waste from the tissues. And so it's going to deliver that waste to the kidneys, which can then remove it from circulation. Also, fluid and electrolyte homeostasis. That is a major component of what the kidney is doing. So the kidney is able to regulate how much fluid is in the blood. If you urinate and lots of fluid comes out, you have dilute urine. That means you had an excess of fluid in the blood, and some of that excess is being removed. Electrolyte concentrations are also regulated by the kidney. So that's another filtering mechanism, is determining exactly what the concentration of things like sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions. The kidney regulates how much of those stick around in the blood. And these two are actually related to one another. You may have heard that a high salt diet, ingesting a lot of salt, can cause high blood pressure. And that's related to this concept that water follows the salts. In particular, water is going to follow solutes. So what that means is, if there are more solutes dissolved in the blood, like salts, there's going to be more water in the blood as well. And the more water there is in the blood, the higher the pressure, the hydrostatic pressure that's going to put on the walls of those blood vessels. And of course we refer to that pressure as blood pressure. So by maintaining the number of electrolytes and the amount of fluid in the blood, the kidneys can actually control blood pressure. So that's a major function of the kidneys, as well as simply filtering out things like wastes and controlling how much salt there is. Also controlling blood pressure is a major job of theirs. Among the other substances that can be filtered from the blood are hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And in controlling the amounts of hydrogen and bicarbonate ions in the blood, the kidney can also control the pH. So pH homeostasis is going to be another critical function of the kidneys. We need to keep our blood around the same pH as water, around 7.4 or so. So kidneys are heavily involved in the regulation of pH, or acid-base homeostasis. And the last major function that we'll talk about right now is the fact that the kidneys are directly responsible for controlling the number of red blood cells in circulation. And we've talked about this pretty recently, this hormone EPO, erythropoietin. And erythropoietin, of course, is a hormone signal to increase the number of red blood cells in the body. So increase red blood cell production, or erythropoiesis. So the kidneys are going to be the control center, and they're going to release EPO in response to low blood oxygen levels. So controlling the number of red blood cells, also a major function of the kidneys. So having discussed the general functions of the urinary system at large, I want to take a second to walk through the major anatomical features of the urinary system. And of course, that starts with the kidneys, the workhorses of the urinary system that are doing the filtration of blood, producing that filtrate. So once the filtrate is produced, it's going to exit each kidney through this space called the hilum that we mentioned before, which is where you have entry of the artery and the renal vein. And you also have another vessel called the ureters. So one ureter is going to escape from each hilum of each kidney. And those ureters are going to take filtrate, or urine, toward the urinary bladder. So the urinary bladder is a hollow organ that is going to store urine. And the urinary bladder is going to be continuous with the urethra. So the urethra is simply where the urinary system meets the outside. It's where you rid your body of the filtrate, or get rid of urine. One other thing I'd like to mention about how urine is being pushed in the direction of the urethra is this term peristalsis. So as we'll find when we start taking a closer look at the digestive system, or many different hollow organs that move a substance, they're going to move that substance through peristalsis. And what peristalsis is it is rhythmic waves of contraction of smooth muscle. So surrounding these ureters, you have layers of smooth muscle. And you'll have a contraction of smooth muscle in one spot, followed by a contraction lower down, followed by a contraction lower down, contraction lower down. And as those contractions proceed toward the urethra, that's going to move whatever substance is in that hollow vessel toward this direction. So rhythmic waves of contraction, and of course after that contraction the muscles then relax. So the contractions proceed in this direction, and that pushes urine also toward the bladder, and eventually is going to get them out through the urethra. So within the abdominal cavity, the kidneys are situated in using a term to describe where they are in the abdominal cavity is the term retroperitoneal. And what retroperitoneal means is basically behind the organs. So the kidneys are going to be found attached to the posterior abdominal wall. And they have three basic, for each kidney, you've got three coverings that we'll be kind of thinking about. The most superficial of these is the fascia, and what the renal fascia's purpose is to anchor the kidney in place. So this fascia is going to attach to the musculature of the abdominal wall, and also attached to the peritoneum, which holds a lot of the other internal organs. But so the fascia anchors the kidneys in place. It's made of a dense, irregular, collagen-based tissue, so lots of irregularly arranged collagen fibers make up the fascia, the renal fascia. Deep to the renal fascia, you'll actually find a layer of adipose tissue, of fat, that we call the adipose capsule. And this is primarily going to serve as a cushion for the kidneys. So when things are being jostled around inside the abdominal cavity, the kidneys are not injured because they have this fatty cushion. And deep to that adipose cushion is going to be the renal capsule, which is a thin layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. And its primary purpose is going to be the ultimate barrier between the kidney and the outside, and it's going to protect against infection and some structural damage. So its primary purpose is just protection. Now, if you were to take a cross section of the kidney, you would then really be able to see the functional bits of the kidney, or what are the structures within the kidney that lead to production of urine. So looking at the overall structure inside of the kidney, we can break the kidney into two basic regions. You have the outermost cortex, which I've drawn a red dotted line to separate the cortex from the inner medulla. So there's the cortex on the outside and the medulla on the inside of the kidney. And it's interplay between structures that cross the cortex and the medulla that leads to filtration of blood. So the structure that actually crosses between the cortex and the medulla is called the nephron. So the structure that's doing the filtering within the kidney is the nephron. That's the functional unit of the kidney. And each kidney has between 250,000 and 1 million nephrons. So each nephron is able to filter some blood, and up to 1 million of these can be found per kidney. So in the cortex, that's where you're going to have blood being delivered to the nephron. So you have your artery that's going through, again, the hilum of the kidney, and it's going to be branching off. That artery is going to branch off, and we'll take a closer look at the blood supply of the kidney. But blood is going to be delivered out to the cortex, where the filtering apparatus begins. And that filtering apparatus is going to kind of weave its way in and out of the medulla. And we'll see why this is important. But again, the two main regions of the kidney would be the cortex and the medulla. So within the medulla, you'll actually find these triangular shapes and those are the renal pyramids. So these renal pyramids really make up what the medulla is in the kidney, and that's where the nephron is going to travel, into the medulla, into those renal pyramids. And just a little bit of a spoiler to get ahead and get into kind of how this happens. The medulla is going to be very salty. There's lots of salt that's trapped in these renal pyramids. And as I mentioned earlier, water follows salt. So these renal pyramids are going to be very important for reabsorption of water. They're going to pull water out of that filtrate as the nephron passes through the medulla. So salt attracts water, and the medulla is very salty. So water reabsorption primarily takes place here in the medulla. In between these renal pyramids, you have the renal columns, and that's where you're going to have the blood. The majority of the blood supply is going to be found in between the pyramids, in those renal columns. So arterial blood is going to be coming in, traveling to the nephron, where it can then be filtered, and then traveling back out the renal column in the form of a renal vein. So let's talk about the filtration a little bit more. So filtration is going to occur again in the nephron, and attached to the nephron are structures called collecting ducts. So the collecting ducts are going to be the structures that collect the filtrate, whatever has been removed from the blood that will eventually become urine. So collecting ducts collect urine, basically. And those collecting ducts are traveling their way through these renal pyramids. And those collecting ducts merge and become larger and larger and direct urine toward the tip of these pyramids. And we call the tip of those pyramids the papilla. So one of my favorite terms that's often used in medical anatomy or just anatomy in general is papilla or papillary, which means shaped like a nipple. So you can remember the tip of these renal pyramids. Someone decided that they're shaped like a nipple, so those are called papillae. So the collecting ducts are collecting urine and taking it towards these papillae, and you'll find these little dips now toward the center of the kidney. This is going to be the area. The direct center is called the pelvis, and that's where eventually all the urine from all of these renal pyramids is going to end up, is in the pelvis, and then it's going to exit out the ureter. But there are a few different steps before urine gets to the pelvis. First, it's going to be found in these little indentations. So the urine exits the papilla, and it's going to be found in what's called a calyx, or calyces would be plural. And there's a small calyx that leads into a larger calyx. The small one is called the minor calyx, the larger called the major calyx. And these calyces just collect the urine from the renal pyramid that's exiting the renal pyramids through the collecting ducts. And each of these calyces is going to merge and flow into the renal pelvis. So this is where all of the urine again is collected for each kidney. And finally, that filtrate or that urine is going to travel out the ureters toward the bladder and the urethra. So it is a pretty complex system, but I think it's important that we also discuss the vast blood supply that's taking arterial blood to and bringing venous blood away from the kidney and providing a means for filtration of blood to occur. So the filtering apparatus in the kidney begins with these little black dots that are called renal corpuscles. So those act as the filter, and you need to get the blood to the filter. So arterial blood needs to travel toward the filter. Starting off with the arteries that are supplying arterial blood to the filter, to those corpuscles, you have, of course, the abdominal aorta, the large blood vessel, and that abdominal aorta is going to branch off into the renal artery that's going to enter in the hilum of the kidney. That renal artery is going to do what blood vessels often do, is branch and get smaller and smaller. So the first branch of that renal artery is going to be called the segmental artery. The segmental artery branches off again into the interlobar arteries. So those interlobar arteries are going to travel kind of alongside those renal pyramids, right, adjacent to those renal pyramids. Those interlobar arteries are going to kind of curve around the renal pyramid. They're going to branch and curve around. And those curved arteries that are, again, headed toward those filters, the renal corpuscles, those are called the arcuate arteries that kind of arc around the top of the renal pyramids up into the cortex of the kidney. Those arcuate arteries are going to further branch into smaller arteries called interlobular. So we had interlobar that are kind of alongside the pyramids, and then interlobular up top. And then finally, those interlobular arteries are going to further branch into arterioles. Now, what you remember about arterioles probably is that they're feeding capillary beds. And the renal corpuscle, the filter for blood in the kidney, is actually a modified capillary bed. But interestingly, this capillary bed, which is called the glomerulus inside the renal corpuscle, this capillary bed is fed by, of course, an arteriole called the afferent arteriole, feeds into the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is where filtration is taking place, again, inside the renal corpuscle. The glomerulus, unlike most capillary beds that we've talked about previously, does not feed directly into the venous circulation, but into another arteriole called the efferent arteriole. So it's unique in that way, that this capillary bed feeds directly into another arteriole. So this is, again, pretty complicated, but this is how arterial blood is fed ultimately toward the glomerulus. So what I'll note is that the afferent arteriole is feeding blood into the glomerulus where filtration is taking place. So the blood that's escaping into this efferent arteriole heading out of the glomerulus is actually going to have lots of substances. Whatever's been filtered out of it has been removed. And the glomerulus is then going to send that filtrate now into the nephron, where certain substances can be picked and chosen to be reintroduced back into the blood. So the glomerulus, again, is the filter, and the blood leaving the filter leaves through the efferent arteriole. Before we move on to discussing the venous circulation, I would like to also mention that the efferent arteriole that contains that filtered blood is going to then be transferred into what are called the peritubular capillaries. So the peritubular capillaries are the second set of capillaries that you find in the vasculature of the kidneys. The first capillary was inside the glomerulus, and that's actually what's doing the filtering again. The peritubular capillaries that the efferent arteriole feeds into are called peritubular because they're going to wrap themselves around the nephron. So the nephron, again, contains the filtrate, what's been removed from the blood. And as that filtrate passes through the nephron, there can be substances that are pulled out of that filtrate and put back into the peritubular capillaries, back into the blood. So not everything that is filtered out at the stage of the glomerulus is going to be removed in the form of urine. Some things that get filtered out at the glomerulus actually return back to the peritubular capillaries, and that puts substances that are necessary that we want to return to the blood. It keeps them from being wasted, but from being removed in the urine. So there's interaction between the nephron, which we'll spend plenty of time talking about what the nephron is. But the nephron is a series of tubes carrying the filtrate, the urine, or what will become the urine. And again, these peritubular capillaries wrap themselves around the nephron, and certain substances that made it into the nephron can be transferred back into the blood, into those peritubular capillaries. What you see in the venous portion of the vasculature of the kidney is very similar to what you saw with the arterial circulation. It's divided into small branches that, as opposed to branching out and becoming smaller, as is the case with veins, they're going to merge and become larger. But the pattern is the same. You start with peritubular venules. So now these are tiny venules that surround the tubules of the nephron. And those venules merge to become veins, starting with the smallest, the interlobular veins, right here. And those merge to become the arcuate veins, kind of arcing again around the renal pyramid, merging into the interlobar veins in between the renal pyramids where the renal columns are. And those interlobar veins are going to merge into the renal vein. Finally, the renal vein exits and delivers venous circulation toward the inferior vena cava. So before we move on to what I previously referred to as the functional unit of the kidney, which is the nephron, I need to talk about the filtration apparatus on kind of a surface level. We'll be going into more detail about how this structure is regulated. So this whole thing is called the renal corpuscle, again, which is fed by the afferent arteriole, which feeds into the structure called the glomerulus. So the glomerulus, again, is this set of capillaries inside the corpuscle. So the afferent arteriole feeds into these glomerular capillaries. And then whatever is not filtered out in this filter goes into the efferent arteriole. Now, within the glomerulus, the glomerular capillaries are porous. So as was the case when we talked about other capillaries, some being more porous than others, letting some really large things out of those capillaries, like those sinusoidal capillaries that have big holes in them. These capillaries are also porous, and they have slits so that they can act as a filter. So just like a water filter allows water to go through and traps some other things, the glomerulus, these glomerular capillaries, are porous, and they allow water, amino acids, glucose, electrolytes, and other small things that can fit through those slits to be removed from the blood to produce what's called filtrate. So the filtrate that's going to enter the nephron and eventually will become urine is going to contain things that we still want in our blood. Amino acids and glucose are things that we don't want to be urinating out. Those are useful to our bodies. So those are going to be reabsorbed into the blood in the nephron. But at this point, they've made it into the filtrate. They've been filtered out of the blood, along with other things that are small, like waste. And among those waste products being like urea. So the glomerulus inside the corpuscle is the system of capillaries that is doing the filtering. And the other part of the corpuscle is called Bowman's capsule. So this is the capsule that surrounds the glomerulus and is the entry point for filtrate. So whatever's filtered out of the blood, all of these things and waste, are going to be filtered into the nephron and into Bowman's capsule. So these are the components of the filtering apparatus. And again, we'll go into a little bit greater detail in the near future.